We're anticipating a media briefing from the Energy and Electricity Minister, Dr. Hosien Ramokgopa. Changes, it seems, are afoot in the country's energy mix, with nuclear set to get a whole lot more capacity, or let me just say, with the energy mix setting to have a whole lot more nuclear involvement. That's at least what we know so far. But a man who's slightly more informed is our economics editor, Tshepo Mongoai, who's with us here in studio. Great to see you, sir. Thanks for your time and patience. This is important because, of course, South Africa is still very much within an energy crunch, even though we're marking weeks now without load shedding. What do you know about what the minister is likely to say?
Well, from our sources, we understand that the briefing is going to focus mainly around nuclear generation. We do know that government has actually suffered several setbacks in terms of its strategy to increase nuclear generation. So our sources told us that it's more likely that the minister will withdraw the plan when it comes to nuclear. They will go back, they will strengthen it, they will polish it, and of course before considering taking back to the market, because the government has maintained that nuclear remains part of the integrated resource plan and will remain so, and they've been quite intentional for quite some time. And clearly the court judgment actually show that there have been a lot of weaknesses, perhaps in some areas when it comes to the implementation of nuclear. There were a lot of critics. One issue was around costs. And then also the issue of safety as well.
Right.
Yeah. So it is going to focus around that, and of course they will indicate the time frame in terms of the time horizon, where they are going to, when are they going to work, how long is this going to take. What is going to be the focus areas in the next few months or years, if so. And I suppose this is going to be celebration, I think, for those who have been against nuclear for quite some time. But you and I know that it's mainly some people who've worked for ESCOM, some they've worked for South African Nuclear Energy Corporation, who are now in business. Fighting on each side, and there's a lot of business interest here, and I think it's very important for government to rise above the differences that at times are motivated by business, and of course even the lobby groups that come out. Some of them are financed by some of these businesses, so it's important that the strategy looks at the interest of the country in the medium term. There are pros and cons on both sides in terms of renewable and nuclear, but there's also been advancement on both sides in terms of technology that address those weaknesses in those technologies. So it is very important that government comes up with a better plan that can look at that. It's unlikely that there will ever be a time where people all agree and say, yeah, government, then we'll rally behind this particular strategy. So there will always be those differences, but it's important that government does the right thing.
It's certainly a balancing act, and I know we use that term a lot in the media, but in all kind of paths that we decide to take, somebody is likely to benefit. And the question becomes whether or not that benefit is justifiable. You know, even when the debate was raging around IPPs, I remember there were a lot of conversations around who ultimately is cashing in on this crisis that the country is currently facing, and the ministry will have to go a long way in trying to ease some of those, let's call them, concerns.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's huge budget. It's a lot of money for even in jet transition. I mean, we're talking about 1.4 trillion rand that is going to be spent across different sources of energy that's renewable. Nuclear is not cheap either. It is expensive. There are, as I indicated, issues of safety that have been highlighted, but there's been some advancement. And the one issue was on transparency when it comes to nuclear. That government has not been transparent. There was no proper public consultations. And we know that with nuclear, you're probably going to have one service provider that will have to build the whole thing from beginning to end. And at times, service provider enter into non-disclosure agreement with government because there's certain sensitive information that they will do everything to protect, whether for competition or perhaps certain information might not be palatable in the public, you know. So I wonder how government is going to deal with that, because that is bound to happen. There's going to be sensitive information that whoever they appoint will have to try to protect. And they've been quite clear that, of course, in the past, there was no transparency. So that's one area they really would like to address.
And many people are watching that space very closely. In the kind of distant past, we had concerns around the Russians being involved in South Africa's nuclear ambitions. More recently, the power ship saga has also featured quite prominently. I remember among the contentious issues was just the time in which this contract would be around and how much that would effectively cost the country. To your point, I imagine people are going to be a whole lot more demanding of even just the technical terms of what bolstering the country's nuclear capacity will entail.
No, true. And I think the costs is going to raise eyebrows.
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot of money. But we understand that over time, nuclear can be quite affordable. If you say after 20 years, 10 years, it becomes cheaper and it gives constant power supply. We know that, for example, we are dealing with inclement weather conditions at the moment, and I don't think the picture is likely to improve. So it needs to address those issues. I mean, it might happen. We don't know that we have 3 days with no sun because of the changing weather patterns. What is going to happen? I mean, I'll make an example. In Brazil, for example, they've got lots of rains all the time, and most of their electricity actually relies on hydro. And as a result, that's their main source. But they suffered massive drought, and as a result, the water levels were depleted, and they could not generate electricity. And they had to invest in alternative. And of course, those alternatives are expensive, and at times they don't really rely or use them as such. They're just idling. But they've learned the tough lessons that not having this kind of energy, you run the risk that if there is changes in weather patterns, then you run the problem of not having electricity at all. Zambia is one classical example. They are currently in the middle of a drought. They are relying on hydro. They don't have enough electricity in their country. So it's finding that balance,
yeah.
if like you've put it. So and there are a lot of competing interests. And there are people who are speaking from their own personal interest. So the government must look at all these issues broadly and not just for the next 5 years and 10 years. One question that was raised was, for example, with the solar panels that we have, in 20 years' time, those panels will have to be replaced. Where do they go?
Absolutely.
Where do we put them? So that's another issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
So in both ways, there are pros and cons.
Absolutely, and apologies for interrupting you there, because what you're alluding to is a concept which I found so interesting, because solar is being punted as a much safer, environmentally friendlier option. But to your point, waste in 20 years' time might ironically raise a lot of environmental questions around how we deal with those materials if the panels themselves can't be used. But we'll let the minister speak.